Vaccinations are credited for saving millions of lives in the United States. That is widely accepted. Today we'll take a look at something far more controversial, which is the state's ability to mandate vaccination of children. Hello and welcome to TalksOnLaw. I'm Joel Cohen. Today we're joined remotely by Professor Dorit Reiss of UC Hastings Law School in California. Professor Reiss, welcome to TalksOnLaw.
Thank you for having me.
Before we jump into the legal issues, Professor, maybe you can take us through a little history. When did vaccination become common in the United States?
So the first vaccine was the smallpox vaccine created in the end of the 18th century, and it came over to the United States shortly after, toward the end of the 18th century, and became more widespread through the 19th century. You may or may not be aware, smallpox was a major killer with, for the most virulent strain, about 30% of the people who got it died, and over 20% of the rest remained disabled in some way, and many of the others were left with scars. Smallpox killed millions before vaccines, so that vaccine alone likely saved millions of lives, and at this point we have quite a few others.
Fascinating, especially when you think of how horrific the COVID-19 virus is, and that's dealing with a mortality rate that's much, much lower. For those who are uninitiated, the first vaccination was developed in response to smallpox?
Yes. So years before the first vaccine, a practice called inoculation was used against smallpox. Inoculation meant taking some material from someone who had smallpox, from one of their pustules, and letting it dry and putting it into a scratch on someone who didn't have smallpox. That was basically...
So sort of a DIY, do-it-yourself vaccination approach.
Exactly. That was used for several thousands of years before vaccination, and it had risks. About 2% of the people who underwent this procedure died themselves, but compared to 30% mortality from actual smallpox, it was a safer practice. Vaccination was different. Vaccination involved taking a material from people who suffered a different disease, cowpox, which was much milder, and giving it to other people to prevent smallpox.
What was the different disease?
Cowpox. So the old story is that Jenner noticed that milkmaids that got cowpox didn't later get smallpox. So he realized there might be protective effects. Cowpox was a disease that affected cows but could jump to humans. The actual story is a little more complex. There was apparently use of some horsepox material in the first vaccine as well. But still, we're talking about taking a pox virus that affects animals and giving it to human to give them basically a mild infection that doesn't have the risks of smallpox, but will immunize them against smallpox.
So for the dummies like myself, it's giving someone a weaker or less dangerous version of the disease to enable them to fight off the more virulent version.
Exactly right. And part of what's fascinating is that this was done before we understood infectious disease the way we understand them today, before germ theory. So it was mostly based on observation rather than understanding. It still worked. Today, we have a better understanding and a lot more technologies that allow us to create a whole range of vaccines. And today, we can create vaccines that are much safer than the old smallpox vaccine, which did have side effects that would be considered unacceptable today, and was also given in unsanitary conditions, because at the time, hygiene was not well understood either.
And you could imagine if you're simply drawing from tissue of a sick person, you might not know the dosage that you're getting.
No.
You might be giving one patient an incredible amount of a virus or bacteria, and another maybe something a little more palatable by their immune system.
Yeah, I think that the vaccine at the time really varied at how well it worked, in part because of preparation. And again, hygiene was a big issue. Some people who were vaccinated against smallpox in the 19th century got tetanus because of lack of hygiene, which is a horrible result.
As we're talking about vaccinations, it's important to discuss the concept of herd immunity. Professor, what is that?
So the idea is, if enough people in a community are immune to a disease, the germ can't jump from one person to another because the new host is already immune and kills the germ before they can take hold. To remind you, communicable disease spread from one person to another. If a disease ends up in someone who's already immune, that person is no longer a host that allows the virus or the bacteria to replicate a lot of times and keep jumping. It doesn't matter to the germ whether you're immune because you got the disease and healed, or because you got a vaccine and never got the disease. So if vaccine rates are high enough, there's enough people in the community that are immune that the germs can't take hold in the community. They still will come in. Every year, people come into the United States with measles, polio may come in. So people come into the United States with diseases we vaccinate against all the time. But because most people in the United States are vaccinated, they can't find new hosts, and therefore coming in usually doesn't start an outbreak.
Sometimes I think of it as a fire, and not just because we've seen a lot of wildfires in the western part of the country, but the idea is similar in my mind that if you clear out some of the trees, then the fire can't spread and consume the entire forest.
That's a great parallel. You do a protective ring around the areas that are already infected, and the problem can't get out.
So is herd immunity dependent on each disease? So is there a targeted goal for measles and a targeted goal for polio?
Yes, for the diseases we have vaccine for, herd immunity depends on two things: how contagious is a disease and how effective is the vaccine. For measles, it's such a contagious disease that you really need 95% of the population immune to achieve herd immunity. But for polio, you'll probably find with 80% or less.
We're going to be talking a lot about school mandates. Maybe you can just lay out a quick example of what the basic mandate looks like.
So states vary, like with many other things, but most states require MMR, which prevents measles, mumps, and rubella, requires DTaP, which prevents diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis, require hepatitis B and Hib, which is a nasty bacterial infection. Most states don't require influenza. Very few states required HPV vaccine, and on the rest, there's quite a bit of variation.
And is there some type of standard or test that states will use in determining which vaccinations to include?
It's very political. Generally, states are looking at the risk and benefit, but they will also look at consideration such as, is this a vaccine that's unpopular or controversial? HPV vaccine, because it's a sexually transmitted disease, are probably more controversial than other vaccines. A state will also look at, is it cost effective? Is it worth a while? Influenza vaccine are an annual vaccine, and it's hard to enforce an annual mandate. So most states don't do that, although Massachusetts just adopted one.
Why don't we jump into the state's role? Obviously, the state wants to keep citizens safe and can go about encouraging that in various different ways. When did the state start making the first mandatory requirements when it comes to vaccination?
So I'll make a general comment first. Preventing infectious disease has been a state role at least 300 or 400 years back. We always say America is created for freedom, but even in America, states always acted to prevent infectious disease from spreading, sometimes by limiting rights. There was never complete freedom to spread an infectious disease. Vaccine mandate started in England in the 19th century, and in the United States, we've had school mandate at least since the 19th century. As far as I know, just since the 19th century, but early in the 19th century, we saw school mandates in Massachusetts and other states. The first case looking at a school mandate is Abel versus California in 1890. It's Abel versus Clark. It was California required children to get a smallpox vaccine before they go to school. Several people challenged it.
I don't know why. I'm not surprised that California is the first case on record for a lawsuit on vaccinations.
Yes, it's not the first vaccine mandate. It's just the first case challenging it. And several people challenged it, and the Supreme Court in California upheld it, saying it's part of the state public health and the state can't do that. We've had multiple other cases in the 19th century around school mandates, and in most of them, all that I know, courts upheld the vaccine mandate for school.
How is it that it became so focused on children and schools?
I'm a little bit guessing, but here's my best guess. School mandates work. They come with an enforcement mechanism. You don't vaccinate your child, the state can prevent your child from going to school. People care about that, so it's a very effective tool to get people to vaccinate their children. Second, children are spreaders, and school environments are areas where diseases spread. To give you another country example, in Japan, where they vaccinated school children against influenza, influenza dropped in the older population as well. So children in school transmit disease to one another. They're close together. They are not as careful about hygiene as adults. And then the disease go home with them. So schools are an area of transmission, and they have an enforcement mechanism.
Today we know that all states have vaccine mandates, but we know that that wasn't always the case.
Yes. The big change was in the 1960s and 1970s, where after the measles vaccine, states that mandated measles vaccine for school had a lot less measles outbreaks than states that didn't. Starting with the 70s and then going on in the 80s and 90s, school mandates spread. They were contagious from state to state. And by the 1990s, all states had them.
Professor, I don't mean to be hitting you with these questions that are maybe better suited for an epidemiologist, but how serious is the measles virus if it's causing this national reaction?
So the thing about measles, so first of all, measles is one of the more serious rash-based disease. In a 2005 article about the clinical significance of measles, I think 2004, the authors pointed out that between 1987 and 2000, the rate of death from measles was 3 in 1,000, and the rate of complication was about 30%. Not all of them were serious. That includes diarrhea and ear infections, which can be very serious. But measles can kill. It can leave you deaf or brain damaged. And at best, it's miserable. What's unique about measles, however, what's caused this reaction is not just that it is a serious disease, it's that it's the most contagious virus known to man. And it has a very effective vaccine. So it's a case to see. In a population that's highly vaccinated, you may see measles come in. You may see 1 or 2 cases because it's that contagious and might reach someone who's not immune. But that would be it. The moment vaccination rates drop, if measles come in, it's going to spread. So it's kind of the canary in the coal mine. When it comes in and there's not enough vaccines in the population, we see it.
Why don't we take a look at the Supreme Court? What has our nation's top court had to say when it came to these school mandates?
So in 1905, the first vaccine mandate case came to the Supreme Court, and it wasn't a school mandate. It was a city adult mandate in the context of a smallpox outbreak.
What was that case?
It was Jacobson versus Massachusetts in 1905. The city of Cambridge had a smallpox outbreaks and said, you vaccinate or you pay a $5 fine. Pastor Jacobson didn't want to pay the fine and challenged his conviction all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said, sorry, if there's a public health necessity and the state is taking a reasonable proportionate measure, your individual rights have to be put aside for the public health.
In that case, it was even a little broader than a school mandate. There, it was a city requiring it. Am I right that it was requiring it for all citizens?
Yes. It had a medical exemption for children, but not for adults. And the interesting thing about Jacobson is that it kind of has 2 faces. On one hand, it says, yes, the state can act for the public health, even if it's interfering with individual rights, up to requiring it to vaccinate. On the other side, it said there are conditions. It has to be reasonable, it has to be for a public health necessity, and it has to be proportionate. So the state has broad power to require vaccine, but with limits. Now, public health experts read 2 more limits into the jurisprudence, which are that you have to avoid harm to the subject, and you have to be fair. You can't enforce this in a discriminatory matter. That's not from Jacobson. That's from another case. So that was the first word. In 1922, the court shortly applied Jacobson to a school mandate and said, Jacobson clearly allows you to mandate vaccines for school.
And what was that case?
It was Zucht versus King, Z-U-C-H-T, and it was a San Antonio school mandate without an outbreak.
You mentioned that one of the requirements is that it can't cause a certain level of harm. Now that seems like a particularly tricky test to pass if every once in a while someone has an adverse reaction or even dies from a vaccination.
Yes, the way it's framed is as harm avoidance. And that doesn't mean that the measure has zero risks. The smallpox vaccine clearly had risks, but it still meets the harm avoidance requirements because the smallpox vaccine also prevents risks to the person. The balance of risk benefits means that it reduces harm to the individual generally, not that it has no risk whatsoever.
So if that's the test, what are the exceptions?
So from Jacobson itself, the only exception that's probably constitutionally ground is a medical exception, which basically means that if for a specific individual, the risks of vaccinating are higher than the risk of not vaccinating because of a medical condition, that individual should be exempt.
Could you give me an example? Is this, I might not need the measles vaccination because I have an autoimmune disorder.
So autoimmune disorder isn't actually a good example because they're not usually a contraindication. They're not usually a medical reason not to vaccinate. But let's say that you had a heart transplant. I have a good friend whose child was born with a heart defect, had to undergo a transplant at 7 weeks. Because he has a transplant, he's on medication that makes his immune system less aggressive. And that means he cannot get live virus vaccines like the measles vaccine. He just can't be vaccinated against measles because his immune system won't be able to fight off even the weak virus we have in vaccines. Children like that, or adults like that with transplants, adults who are on chemotherapy, which undermines their immune system, can't get live virus vaccine, and they need a medical exemption. Someone who had a severe allergic reaction, let's say to a gelatin containing vaccine, about in 1 of a million cases, someone will have a severe allergic reaction to a gelatin containing vaccine. Some vaccines include gelatin as a stabilizer. In about 1 in a million cases, someone has a severe allergic reaction to that. Those people should not get another gelatin containing vaccine. So they should have a medical exemption from those vaccines.
Let's talk about the First Amendment. There are some people who have religious objections to certain medical treatments or procedures. How does that impact vaccination mandates?
So under our jurisprudence, there is no constitutional requirement to give a medical exemption from a child vaccine mandate. And there are 2 parts to that. Part 1 is our general jurisprudence on religious exemptions right now says that if there's a law neutral and of general applicability, you don't have to exempt people with religious objections. We don't have to give exemptions from tax laws or from vaccine laws. The other part is specific to vaccines. There's a jurisprudence that for vaccines, you don't have to give a religious exemption. And the rationale there is twofold. A, because vaccines protect others, you can't let your religion put in danger people outside your families. And B, because we're talking about children, your child didn't choose the religion, and your religious views don't justify leaving the child at risk of disease.
So you're saying it's not constitutionally required, but are they still out there, or does it depend on the state?
Yes, most states still give a religious exemption, even though it's not constitutionally required, because we are a religious nation. And I will point out that a religious exemption is in some ways a bad deal, because our jurisprudence doesn't require it. But if you do give one, it makes it really hard to police them and to limit them to only people who are really religious in this.
How do you mean?
So here are a few examples. One thing states try to do is say only people from a religion that opposes vaccine can get a religious exemption, because that's easier to police. It's easier to police whether you're a Christian Scientist than whether you in your heart really believe vaccines are bad. Court said no, because that discriminates for organized religion and against people with the same beliefs that are not part of organized religion. So you can't require a letter from the clergy or to show that you're a member of a religion. Another thing states tried is to say, if your religion supports vaccine, let's say if you're a Jew or a Catholic, you can't use a religious exemption. Court said, no, we're not helping Judaism or Catholicism enforce their tenets on their believers. We're asking, what does this person believe? It's about personal belief.
So interesting. So if I'm Jewish and I want to say that my particular religious beliefs prohibit me from getting a vaccination, who is the state to tell me, well, actually, we talked to your rabbi and he says otherwise?
Exactly. And there were cases just like that, where the rabbi of the person said, no, according to my reading, Judaism support vaccine, and the court said, that's not the test.
So in a sense, these religious exemptions can serve as a philosophical exemption as well, or is that something entirely different?
So the idea of religious exemption is it has to be about something fundamental, something that is related to a worldview. You can't say, I think vaccines cause autism and therefore I don't vaccinate. Personal belief exemptions allow you to claim whatever you want, basically, to just, you don't even have to explain it usually, just to say, I have a personal belief against this, I'm not vaccinating. It doesn't have to be grounded in a worldview or in a religion.
Do those exist, or is that something that has been argued for and rejected?
They exist in about 15 states. There were more until recently. In 2019, Maine removed its personal belief exemption. In 2015, California removed it. Vermont removed the personal belief exemption, though it kept a religious exemption. So there were more, but there's still over 15.
But now, even if you're in a state that doesn't have this belief exemption, couldn't you just transfer it and argue that it's a religiously held belief?
Yes. We're seeing so the general thing about the religious exemption is that people who believe vaccines are bad don't hesitate to lie about the reasons being religious. So there's a lot of indications.
If you believed, and you and I don't, but if you believed that a vaccination was harming your children, perhaps you'd be willing to say anything to keep your child, in your view, safer.
Yeah, that's one reason I think religious exemptions are a bad idea. If you want to let people get out of vaccines, don't make them lie for it. If you want to give people an out, make it a personal choice and let people get out without having to lie and say it's religion.
So in a sense, that's an argument for these belief exemptions because in a way they can be more honest.
Yes, but we have very good data that shows that states that use the personal belief exemption have more exemptions than states that only have a religious one, and that states that have easier to get exemptions have more of them and more outbreaks.
Why don't we talk about an example where there was a flare-up or more outbreaks? What happened in California in 2015?
So everybody starts in 2015, but I do want to point out that in 2014, California had the largest measles outbreak it had since the 1990s of 60 people. And that was heavily discussed at the time. But then in 2015, we had an outbreak that was larger. We are still not sure who the first person that brought measles was, but there were cases of people that went to Disneyland and had measles outbreak. And those cases spread. It spread to 17 states, Mexico and Canada. We gave Mexico its first measles case in a long, long time with a two-year-old that visited Disneyland. We exported a large outbreak to Canada. We had over 170 cases, and most of them were intentionally unvaccinated.
So you had 170 cases. Did people die, or was this just a very unpleasant experience unnecessarily for 170 people?
Nobody died. Now, remember, the death rate for measles is between 1 and 3 in 1,000. So 170 cases, nobody dying yet isn't that surprising. However, I think over 20% people were hospitalized. Some of them suffered long-term harm. And one comment about death, measles is a little tricky that way. Measles kills in two ways. In about 1 in 1,000 cases, it kills directly. And the numbers on the second one vary, but in other cases, years after you had measles, the measles virus reawakens in your body and destroys your brain from the inside. And that's always fatal. That's called SSPE. So we don't know yet whether there will be any death. Maybe not, because it was only 170 cases, but we don't know yet.
So California was hit with this unprecedented measles outbreak that spread to other states and internationally. How did they respond?
Again, this was the second year in a row that California had a high number of measles cases, higher again than any time since the 1990s. California responded by saying, enough is enough. We've tightened our vaccine law in 2012. once by adding a requirement that people that are exempt get a signature from the doctor that they discuss vaccines risk and benefit. In 2015, California legislators decided to remove the non-medical exemption. And it was a big battle, but they went ahead and removed it.
So they got rid of that belief exemption.
Yes, it was challenged in the court, and the law was upheld in, I'm not sure if to count it as 5 or 6, because one of them was a lawsuit that was first brought in the federal court and then taken to state court, but at least 5 courts upheld the law.
So you've mentioned that a consequence for refusing to vaccinate a child might be not allowing the child to attend school. How much further could the state go in punishing a refusal to vaccinate?
The state could probably impose a criminal sanction, such as jail time, up to a point. I don't know if you can send someone to jail for 10 years, but for example, France and Italy have jail time attached to vaccination mandates of about 6 months. It's not usually enforced, but it can be in theory. And there's nothing in our constitution that would prevent that. We do criminalize other parental behaviors, such as leaving a child in the car.
And how about actually forcing the child, perhaps sending doctors to schools and requiring vaccination with or without parental approval?
That has been done at least once in 1991 in a measles outbreak in Philadelphia. Children were dying, and a court ordered children vaccinated against parental will, and the police went in and escorted the doctor, and 9 children were vaccinated against parental will. So if you have a situation where the disease actually poses a risk to the children, where other measures didn't work, and again, we're talking about children who don't have the right to make their own decision, the state probably can step in and force vaccinate. But again, you will want to look at the circumstances. It should be a pretty high risk situation.
Any other examples of states vaccinating against parental will that you can share with us?
So 2 contexts. One, where a child is put in state custody, sometimes the state will order vaccination against parental will and carry it out. It's been done in multiple states, and the courts generally uphold it. 2,
in state custody, do you mean juvenile detention or foster care?
Usually foster
or
care.
Something else?
Or just becoming a state ward, going into an orphanage. When the state is holding the child, the state can order vaccination. The other context is in a custody case where one parent wants to vaccinate and the other does not. If the court finds that vaccinating is in the best interest of the child, and they usually do, the court will order vaccination over the opposition of the opposing parent.
So if there's one parent for, one parent against, the state will be the tiebreaker.
Yes, as with other parental disputes.
Professor, before we let you go, are there any additional tools or strategies that you think states or cities can employ to improve vaccination numbers or to have better outcomes?
Yes, I think, in fact, there's a number of tools that we haven't used and can use more aggressively. For example, Colorado couldn't quite get to removing an exemption, so it passed a law that's more moderate. And one of the things it did is it said, schools send parents a letter with your vaccine rates. Let parents know proactively how many children in the school are vaccinated. That increases transparency and can lead to social pressure that can help vaccine rates. We haven't used financial penalties at all. We can make it easy for parents who are harmed by non-vaccination. For example, their child got measles from an unvaccinated child, to sue the parents of the unvaccinated child.
But is that actually a tort? Is there an obligation that can be placed on an individual to prevent disease spread?
There's some doubt, but the state legislator can resolve it by making it law that says clearly that if you don't vaccinate and someone is harmed, they can sue you. The legal barrier is that normally there's no duty to act. But the legislator can create a duty to act. Normally, if you're sitting, again, and sipping your Mai Tai, and you see a baby crawl into the puddle and drown, you can keep on sipping your Mai Tai. It's morally reprehensible, but you don't have a legal obligation to interfere.
A horrible thought.
Isn't exactly the same, but the parents will claim we don't have a duty to act for the benefit of others. Another potential thing states can do is allow children, and some states already do it, allow children let's say from the age of 14 and up, to agree to vaccination even if their parents don't agree. The best way to do it is by legislative action, because you want to cover things like confidentiality, but states can allow minors 14 and up to consent to vaccination, and there's good reasons to do that.
Professor Reiss, thank you for your time and joining us here today.
Thanks for talking to me.